Justin Fields may be on the move, but he ain't coming to Atlanta, and the Falcons have no regrets with passing on him thanks to Desmond Ridder's potential.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the most humble host that has ever existed in this multiverse of humanity and all these alternate realities that make up the universe of course, of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And guys, we thank you for making this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And of course, make sure you check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So today's episode, for the last couple of days, we've been had nothing sort of specific I wanted to get into. We'll have a little bit more structure on tomorrow's episode, but just sort of looking at the news of the day and talking about it. And, Jason La Canfora, formerly of CBS Sports, I guess now he's of Odyssey. A lot of stuff was humming about his takes that were kind of Falcons adjacent, him connecting the Falcons to Lamar Jackson, which is, again, makes total sense. We'll continue to hear that for the next couple of weeks. So nothing new there. Again, I think that stems mostly from, the assumption if the Falcons were all in on Deshaun Watson last year, why wouldn't they be all in on Lamar Jackson this year? And I get that, but I personally think the circumstances that were pushing them, i.e. Arthur Blank in Deshaun Watson sweepstakes, are less the case now. I don't think Arthur Blank is going to assert his influence quite to the same degree. And so therefore we won't see the team make the play for Lamar Jackson, but we'll see. Obviously we'll keep you covered. Can't write it off as a possibility. Already talked about the reasons why on a previous episode. But the other thing that kind of came out from Jason La Canfora today was him saying that when he left Mobile at the Senior Bowl, more than one NFL GM thought that the Bears were going to trade Justin Fields. And that to me is interesting. And that, prompted, various segments of Falcons Twitter to be like, would the Falcons revisit a Justin Fields trade? And of course the answer is no, because they passed on him one time. Why would they decide retroactively to be like, you know what? He's definitely even, I think the argument is that he's less worth, the hope and the hype today than he was back then. And that's not meant to knock Justin Fields. He just hasn't quite lived up to my expectations and probably a lot of people's expectations. As we've seen flashes of it, but we just haven't seen it consistently. Now I'm skeptical of Jason La Canfora's report on this because, talking to Lauren Cox, the host of Locked On Bears, he seemed to have a very different impression based off of the conversation I was having with him down in Mobile. But, we'll see if the Bears wind up doing that. Like, I wouldn't fault them for doing it because, I think based off of where Fields is in his development at this point to where you think Bryce Young or potentially CJ Stroud could be over the same period of time, like you probably feel a little bit better about going after one of those guys and making that guy your franchise quarterback and trading Fields. But then again, the return on the trade that you would get from trading the number one pick to, say, a team like the Colts or somebody else who's trying to trade up for a Bryce Young or CJ Stroud is probably going to be more than a return you would get from trading Fields at this point in time. But the point of this conversation is to basically talk about, like, even though I was very high on Justin Fields back in 2021 and thought he made the most sense for the Falcons pick, he hasn't quite lived up to those expectations. And I don't have any regrets, nor do I think the Falcons should have any regrets about passing on him. That for me, my investment is in Desmond Ridder moving forward, right? I tend not to spend that much time or energy worrying about the picks that could have happened as opposed to the picks that are, right? And I was invested in Justin Fields, being good until Desmond Ridder got on the field, and now I'm become fully engaged in Desmond Ridder being good, as opposed to worrying about what could have been had the Falcons taken Justin Fields. And I think right now you kind of look at it, even though I still of the opinion that, the good version of Justin Fields that we saw for chunks of this year probably would have been the player that we could have seen from him, right from the jump in Arthur Smith's offense. I thought he was a really good fit in a play action heavy offense that features, a mobile quarterback similar to what we have run under both Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder. I feel like the Falcons are in a good place. And what's interesting about this conversation with Fields versus Ridder, which is not a huge conversation, it's not getting a ton of oxygen, but we're talking about it today, is the thing I've noticed. And, not to paint with too broad a brush, but like, I do feel like I've seen to notice that a lot of the Ridder skeptics, the Venn diagram of the people that were also very high on Justin Fields and wanted the team to take a quarterback at the top of the 2021 draft, there seems to be a lot of overlap. I don't think it's a one-to-one correspondence, but I've noticed there is a tendency of some of the people, the Fields truthers also being Ridder skeptics. And that's interesting to me. And I think some of that stems from false is probably not the right way but a misconception that a lot of people have, that I think a lot of people are struggling to process the idea that the Falcons will have passed on a quote unquote superior talent like Justin Fields in 2021 and then potentially do it again this year with another top 10 pick, for a potential quarterback that may or may not be on the board when the Falcons pick, like a Stroud, a Levis, a Bryce Young, or Anthony Richardson, for a third round talent like Desmond Ridder. Like, that doesn't make any sense. That's baffling to them. And I think the falseness of that stems from a false belief that there's some sort of objective measure of quarterback evaluation. And part of the thing that makes quarterback evaluation so hard, and part of the thing, that I think led to a lot of people being skeptical of Justin Fields, was like, Fields was a slow processor at Ohio State. And the question was, could he speed that up in the NFL? And the answer has been not really. And I think the reason why the Falcons are going to be much more willing to bet on a Desmond Ridder than, regretting the decision to pass on Justin Fields is because of Ridder's superior processing ability, right? And that neck up ability, I think Ridder has, those quote unquote intangibles and all the stuff, that he allegedly possesses, is the things that you're going to want to bet on for Desmond Ridder, that you're going to bet on that the growth that he's going to show from year 1 to year 2, and then from year 2 to year 3 is going to be significant because of those intangible qualities. And while I know, the term game manager and label that is put on Desmond Ridder is often used as a pejorative term, I think partially that does not give Ridder enough credit for being the playmaker that I think he has the capability of being, that was fully on display in that week 18 game, which is why we devoted a large chunk of that all 22 review to breaking down those plays where he was able to be more of that playmaker than a true, pocket game manager, as I think usually that pejorative term is used. I don't think him being a game manager is a bad thing, particularly given that he's a young quarterback. That the reality is that the successful young quarterbacks in the league tend to manage the game really well, and the unsuccessful ones don't. And I think that's kind of the problem with Justin Fields, is like they're trying to get him to a point where he can manage the game really, really well. And that's, and if the Bears do wind up moving on from Justin Fields this offseason, it will be because he doesn't manage the game well enough. And so when people, I bring that up just because like when people label Ridder as, oh, he's just a game manager, like I don't think that's as big a negative as people assume it is when they're saying it. You can do a lot worse than a game manager in terms of just wanting a guy that is just purely a playmaker. And, that's fine if you have, the stabilizing forces on your team, the running game, the offensive line, the defense, that you can, live with the ebbs and flows of your quarterback. But, the Bears haven't had that. So I don't know if it's that beneficial for a team like the Falcons. So I just wanted to touch upon that. We'll talk a little bit more about, Calvin Ridley's potential reinstatement and how that influences the Falcons' future draft picks. And we'll talk about some worthwhile pass rushers like Carl Lawson that I think the Falcons could or should trade for this offseason as we continue today's episode. But before we get there, guys, I want to talk a little bit about Built Bar, right? Everybody wants to eat a little healthier this time of year, but if you want to eat healthy and not have to compromise on taste, Built Bar is the thing for you. It's the healthy protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar because it's covered in 100% real chocolate, but it only includes 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, but a whopping 17 grams of protein. And for years, we've told you to head on over to built.com where you can still go to get sales and check out new flavors. But now, more importantly, you can head to your local Walmart or Sam's Club for Built Bars. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. And if you're at Sam's, run in and grab yourself a 13-bar box of peanut butter brownie or coconut almond. Trust me, guys, you will thank me later. So let's talk about the other news of the day that's Falcons adjacent, and that is Calvin Ridley has begun the process of getting reinstated from his year-long suspension due to gambling last year. And obviously the Falcons traded Calvin Ridley at the trade deadline, surprisingly, at the trade deadline to the Jacksonville Jaguars. And, his reinstatement has conditions applied to it that will affect the outcome of that trade, right? The Falcons got 2 picks, a conditional pick in 2023 and a conditional pick in 2024 as part of that trade. We don't know the exact conditions of the trade of what makes, one pick worth such and such, but what we know about the 2023 pick, later this offseason is that the Falcons will, depending on when Calvin Ridley is reinstated, the Falcons will either get a 5th or a 6th round pick, depending on the date. Again, presumably you're assuming that the reinstatement will happen before the draft or whatever. I don't know. That's my guess. It's like if he's reinstated before the draft, it's a 5th. If he's reinstated after the draft, I guess it's a 6th. Like it starts out, I don't know how that works, but that's just a guess. Have no idea. Once we get more information on the specifics of that, then, we'll update you. Probably the more important condition on this trade is going to be get a lot more attention is the 2024 pick that the Falcons got from the Jaguars, which could be anywhere between a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th round pick, depending on the conditions that Ridley meets. That presumably if Ridley, gets reinstated and plays for the Jaguars this year and has a normal year, it will be at least a 4th round pick. Now, if he hits certain undisclosed incentives, presumably in terms of production and playing time, then that will move to a 3rd round pick. And then when you talk about the possibility of the Jaguars loving Calvin Ridley so much this year that they decided probably, I guess, again, guessing at the timeline, in the next 12 to 13 months to extend him, that 2024 draft pick will turn into a 2nd round pick. So obviously, as I said back in November when we discussed this trade, which is, the Falcon fans, the irony is the Falcon fans that have spent the better part of the last year hating on Calvin Ridley will now have to root for his success because for selfish reasons, it will lead to the Falcons getting a higher draft pick in 2024. So we'll see how that turns out. Obviously, once we get more information about the sort of specific conditions of the trade, we will give you an update there. But let's move the conversation to answering a listener question from Newdrop at DJ Newdrop on Twitter. He asks, is there an edge you think is a possible trade target like Josh Allen or Chase Young or Danielle Hunter? So to answer your question, yes, I think Carl Lawson's probably the guy that, at least based off of the preliminary research I've done, that is a realistic trade possibility, that I could see the Falcons or, another team making a move. The Josh Allen trade talk that's occurred over the last year plus has never really made any sense to me. It just never made sense from my personal opinion. Again, not plugged in by any means, that the Jaguars would realistically try to move Josh Allen, just because, like, if your goal is to make a run in the AFC at any point with Trevor Lawrence in the near future, you're going to need a pass rush to sort of keep the Patrick Mahomes and the Joe Burrows at bay. So moving Allen, even if he hasn't necessarily been a dominant pass rusher thus far in his NFL career, he's certainly your most proven pass rusher. So why would you move on from him at this point in time until other guys emerge? And then Chase Young, that doesn't seem like a realistic trade possibility, right? There's been talk recently about the Commanders not extending the 5th-year option for Chase Young in 2024, which would mean this upcoming season in 2023 would be the final year of his contract. But even if that's the case, in all likelihood, they'll probably just tag him if he has a good 2023 and rebounds this upcoming season. So I don't see any scenario where they trade Chase Young. And what's interesting about that is that's basically the exact same situation that they may find themselves in with Daron Payne, that they opted against extending Payne's 5th-year option. His contract then expired after 4 years after this most recent season. And then, they may potentially tag him. And that's something that is notable because, I know a lot of people have, their whatever it takes free agent, and we'll play the clip.
This is the fight of our lives, and we're going to win. Whatever it takes.
So, and that refers to a previous episode where I mentioned that Jesse Bates is that guy for me, but I know for a lot of Falcon fans, Daron Payne is that guy. And it'll be interesting if he winds up getting franchise tagged on that March 7th deadline, by that March 7th deadline, and therefore won't be available. Thus, there will be a great, what's the Obi-Wan line? A thousand voices cried out in disharmony, or whatever, whatever. I don't know. But that would be the equivalent in the city of Atlanta should Washington tag Payne. But, it's just interesting that those potential parallels. Danielle Hunter is interesting. I think that's probably a little bit more realistic of the ones you mentioned, new drop. Although from what I understand, like, they would have to wait till after June 1st to actually trade him, just from a financial standpoint. So we'll see what the Vikings do in terms of their offseason moves, but it would seem very likely at this point in time that without them really upgrading that edge rusher position, that Danielle Hunter's not going anywhere anytime soon. So to answer your question, Carl Lawson makes the most sense to me. I know he doesn't necessarily fit the 3-down bigger edge that presumably the Falcons will be focused on with Ryan Nielsen in the fold, but I think you could make the exception to Carl Lawson just as a purely pass rusher. If the Falcons were to trade for him, it would basically be a 1-year, $15 million rental, which I think is worthwhile, just because I think he's probably going to give you a lot more juice off the edge than probably any other option that they have available this offseason. I think he's going to be a lot more polished pass rusher than Marcus Davenport would be, or anybody that they could take at the top of this year's draft. So to me, it would be worthwhile to have that type of player in your building or whatever. And those of you guys that were following the podcast 2 years ago know that I was very much on the bandwagon of the Falcons signing Carl Lawson. And then unfortunately, salary cap problems, woes reared their ugly head, and the Falcons were not going to be the spenders that I wanted them to be. As you guys well know, that like it's basically Joe Thuney, Carl Lawson, and who was the guy last year that I was like, we have to sign this player, and we didn't sign the player. But I'm sure you guys are yelling at your phones. But yeah, basically like trading for Carl Lawson would be the do-over that we never got. So he would be the one trade I think is worth the Falcons potentially going after should he be on the trade block. But speaking of one New York Jet in Carl Lawson that may be on the move, let's talk a little bit about another one in Corey Davis and other wide receiver 2 options for the Falcons to add this offseason as we wrap up today's episode. But it is the midway point of the NBA season, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers at FanDuel will get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. That's what they mean with no sweat, and you can do it by downloading FanDuel app. It's safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use. You can bet money lines, you can bet point spreads. I love parlays. I love where you can bet a little and win a lot. And I think FanDuel has a cool feature called a parlay builder, where with the NBA, I can look at players and say, if you score a certain amount of points or a certain amount of assists and a certain amount of rebounds, I can combine those together for a bigger payout. So don't miss your chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So we'll wrap up today's episode shorter than usual, talking a little bit or answering another question from Rise Up. He says, what free agent wide receivers would you like the Falcons to target, and do you expect a receiver to be drafted day 2 by the Falcons? I do think the Falcons taking a receiver day 2 is possible if they do not address their wide receiver need in free agency, right? I think the need at that position is going to be enough where the Falcons are going to pull the trigger relatively early on a wide receiver, best player available and all that stuff and more. They'll find a way where that wide receiver is going to be the best player available, probably in round 2 or round 3, somewhere in that range. It's funny how the board gets manipulated about BPA. But in terms of wide receiver free agents, to be honest with you, I have not come up with a short list of potential targets, or at least one where I'm like, these are the guys I would like the Falcons to sign. I probably should, because the plan at least next week when we do Free Agent Friday is probably to outline the offensive signings that I would probably make in free agency. So I probably should come up with something in like the next 7 or 8 days on that front. But part of the reason why I haven't spent a lot of time or energy thinking about that is because I've just basically made the assumption that the Falcons are going to sign Corey Davis once the Jets cut him, which seems to be the consensus, the safe assumption that the Jets will move on from him. Carl Lawson may be a borderline cut or trade, but it does seem like at least all the Jets coverage I've read over the last month or two seems to be of the agreement that Corey Davis is almost certainly going to get cut by them. And it makes too much sense, in my opinion, for Corey Davis to come home to Atlanta and reunite with Arthur Smith, where he had his best seasons in his NFL career in Tennessee in 2019 and 2020 when Smith was calling plays then. He nearly had a 1,000-yard season in 2020, which led to him getting paid by the Jets, signing like a 3-year, $37 million contract with the Jets. And he's been solid there, but injuries have been an issue. Obviously, the emergence of Garrett Wilson this past year probably makes the Jets, feel like Corey Davis is pretty expendable, that they're not going to pay the price that they would for him to be their number 2, especially when they have, younger, potentially more dynamic players in Garrett Wilson and Elijah Moore, right? And whoever else they have. But for me, it just makes too much sense for both the Falcons, who need a number 2 wide receiver, and Corey Davis is a proven guy in the scheme. And it makes too much sense for Corey Davis to come to Atlanta, just because even if he's looking for like a 1-year prove it deal, that there's probably going to be no better place in Atlanta to resurrect his value in production, given, that history with Arthur Smith. And even if the Falcons are more willing to re-up with him for a multi-year contract, again, you're maximizing your value and your production probably in Atlanta than other places. Although, I know there's been talk that, this year's draft class at wide receiver is not great, is not as good as previous years, nor is the free agent class as great. And there's a lot of teams that are wide receiver needy. And so that could drive up Corey Davis's price, but I'm kind of expecting like a 1 or 2 year deal in like the $10 million range somewhere around there. And I feel like that makes total sense for the Falcons to pay that price for Corey Davis. In terms of other free agents, or at least in my radar, in terms of guys that I'm, sort of, taking a look at and being like, okay, theoretically on paper, that guy makes a lot of sense for the Falcons. I'm looking at guys like Mecole Hardman, Alan Lazard, Darius Slayton, Paris Campbell. All of those guys are impending free agents. Lazard is a proven number 2 that brings a similar size, speed combination that Corey Davis brings. Hardman and Slayton and Campbell are speed guys, fast guys. And, you guys know that I'm very much of the mindset of adding more explosive playmakers at the wide receiver position. And that, Corey Davis is probably more explosive than anybody the Falcons currently have, but I wouldn't necessarily call Corey Davis an explosive wide receiver, at least compared to some of these guys. But because of, his proven status in this offense, if the Falcons are going to go for another quote unquote twin tower type of receiver opposite Drake London, Corey Davis is probably the one that I'm most forgiving of the Falcons going, just because of his proven production. But, Hardman and Slayton and Campbell bring a little bit more juice. And, Hardman's probably the least proven of that group. Slayton and Campbell at least have, probably larger chunks of their careers where they look like viable number 2 receivers. So they make a lot more sense. But those would probably be the 5 guys if I was to come up with a top 5 list. Davis, Hardman, Lazard, Slayton, and Campbell are probably the 5 that I would probably, as my short list, if I'm coming up with one on the fly. So I hope that answers your question, Rise Up. I'm sorry to all you people that, a lot of you guys submitted mocks for me to roast. And I realized after the fact that I don't really want to roast your mocks. So, I said, do that. And I immediately regret that decision. So, if I decide to roast mocks, it will be truly because I have nothing else to talk about on a podcast. And again, as we get closer to April, I'll probably be a lot more open to the idea of roasting some mocks on some mock draft Mondays, because probably at that point, we've exhausted the list of new players that we can talk about. So we'll see. We'll play that by ear. So I will put that on the back burner as far as roasting mocks in the future. But that's going to do it for us, guys, on today's episode. Tomorrow's episode will be, the plan is to do a Free Agent Friday, where we'll do some salary cap 101 stuff and try to, clear up some misconceptions about the salary cap that are common mistakes that I think a lot of people make about the salary cap. And then we'll follow up with subsequent Free Agent Fridays, including probably next week's, where I break down my offensive free agents. And then probably we'll do 2 Free Agent Fridays in March in the lead up to free agency, where I break down the defense, because that's feels like that's the direction the Falcons are going to spend most of their money on. So that's probably 2 episodes worth of content there. And of course, because I actually have a plan for tomorrow's episode, that means something Falcons related will actually happen that we'll have to devote at least half of tomorrow's episode to. This, I appreciate the Falcons for wanting to give content to their first listen each and every day, Arthur Smith and company. But, the timing could be a little bit better. So they'll probably wind up hiring all their coaches tomorrow. So we'll talk about that in addition to the salary cap 101 stuff. But that is the plan for tomorrow. Make us your first listen. Check out the Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft with new hosts Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. As your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every